There was once in a faraway country where few people have ever traveled, one of the most wonderful churches that the world has ever seen, with huge stone columns and dark passages and a grand entrance leading to the main room of the church. In the farthest corner was the organ, and this organ was so loud that sometimes when it played, the people for miles around would close their shutters as if to prepare for a great thunderstorm. At one corner of the church was a great tower with ivy growing over it as far up as one could see. I say as far as one could see because the tower rose so far into the sky that it was only in very fair weather that anyone claimed to be able to see the top. Even then, one could not be certain that it was in sight. And as the men who built the church had been dead for hundreds of years, everyone had forgotten how high the tower was supposed to be. Now all the people knew that at the top of the tower was a wonderful chime of Christmas bells. They had hung there ever since the church had been built, and were the most beautiful sounding bells in all the world. Some people thought that this was because a great musician had cast them and arranged them in their place. Others said it was because of their great height, which reached way up where the air was purest and clearest. The strange thing about the chimes, though, was that no one had heard them ring for years and years. It was the custom on Christmas Eve for all the people in the kingdom to bring to the church their offerings to the Christ child. And when the greatest and best offering was laid on the altar, there used to come sounding above the music of the choir the glorious pealing of the Christmas chimes as they rang out far above in the tower. Some said that the wind rang them, while others believed that they were so high it was the angels who caused them to ring. But for many, many long years, the chimes had never been heard at all. Although no one knew exactly why this was so, it was said that the people had been growing less careful of their gifts for the Christ child, and that no offering was brought which was great enough to deserve the music of the chimes. Every Christmas Eve, the rich people still crowded to the altar, each one trying to bring some gift better than the others, without giving anything that he really wanted for himself. And the church was crowded with those who hoped that their offering would make the chimes ring. But though the service was splendid and the offering plentiful, only the roar of the wind could be heard far up the stone tower. The chimes remained silent. Now, a number of miles from the city, in a little country village where nothing could be seen of the great church but the top of the tower, there lived a boy named Pedro and his little brother. They knew very little about the Christmas chimes, but they'd heard of the wonderful service in the church on Christmas Eve. Pedro had a small piece of silver for which he had worked very hard, and this was to be his offering. While he was sorry he had to make such a small gift, since he had nothing else, he hoped that the Christ child would understand. The day before Christmas was bitterly cold, with an icy wind that sent the lonely snowflakes flying in the air and formed a hard white crust on the ground. Pedro and little brother were able to slip away quietly early in the afternoon, and by nightfall they had trudged so far, hand in hand, that they saw the lights of the big city just ahead of them. They were about to enter one of the great gates in the wall that surrounded it, when suddenly they saw something dark on the snow. It was a poor old woman who had fallen just outside the city, too sick and too tired to enter in where she might have found shelter. The soft white snow had made a sort of pillow for her, and she would soon be so sound asleep in the wintry air that no one could ever waken her again. All this Pedro saw in a moment as he knelt down beside her. He knew that he could not leave her. So he sadly told Little Brother to go on alone. But Little Brother didn't want to, because that would mean that Pedro would miss the Christmas festival. But Pedro, much as he wanted to go, knew that he couldn't leave the poor old woman whose face looked like the Madonna in the chapel window. Little Brother still waited, hoping that Pedro would decide to go with him. But Pedro told him to hurry so that he would not miss the service. Then Pedro gave him the little piece of silver he'd been saving and asked him to slip up to the altar when no one was looking and lay it down as his offering. And so Pedro hurried Little Brother off to the city, trying hard to keep back the tears as he heard the crunching footsteps sounding farther and farther away in the twilight. It was very hard remaining behind, helping the poor old woman in the snow, for it meant he had to miss the music and the splendor of the Christmas celebration that he'd been planning for so long. The great church was a most wonderful place that night. When the organ played and the thousands of people sang the glorious hymns, the walls shook with the sound, and little Pedro, far away in the cold snow outside the city walls, felt the earth tremble around him. After the beautiful service was over, the majestic procession with all the splendid offerings to be laid on the altar began. Rich men and beautiful ladies of the kingdom marched proudly up to the altar to lay down their gifts to the Christ child in the hope that their offering would make the chimes ring. A famous warrior strode forward in his suit of gleaming armor to deposit his offering, a great sword, all encrusted with the rarest jewels. All the people leaned forward excitedly in their seats, listening eagerly for the sound of the chimes. But the bells were silent. Behind him came a beautiful noblewoman, clad in a gown of blue and white silk, bearing a lovely picture painted by the kingdom's greatest artist. But still the chimes did not ring. Then followed the richest banker in the realm, bearing a huge golden casket so heavy that he could hardly carry it. With a confident smile on his face, he opened his treasure chest, revealing a vast quantity of glittering gold and jewels. But the chimes still did not ring. The procession moved on, and the altar was crowded with many and rare gifts of every kind from all the corners of the kingdom. Those who had brought offerings stood in a row behind the altar, silent and sullen in their great disappointment, for each one had fervently hoped his or her gift would bring forth the ringing of the chimes. Yet still the chimes remained strangely silent. All that the vast throng assembled in the church could hear was the cold, cold wind sighing through the great stone tower far above. On the faces of the assembled throng in the church, there were written expressions of disappointment and shattered hope, for all thought that surely, with such a magnificent collection of offerings, the glorious chimes would at last sound forth. But alas, they were as silent as could be. Then suddenly the hopes of the multitude arose. The king of the country himself marched down the aisle to present his gift to the Christ child. Even he, like all the others, hoped that he would win the ringing of the chimes. king took off his crown, heavy with sparkling diamonds and rubies and other precious stones, and to the amazement of the assembled throng, he laid it gleaming on the altar as his offering for the Holy Child. As the king stood there with an expectant smile on his face, the multitude leaned forward eagerly, holding their breath in excitement and suspense. "Surely the chimes will ring tonight," they said. "Nothing like this has ever happened within the memory of man. And if they don't ring after this noble gift of the great king, why should they ever ring at all?" But still the chimes were silent, and so the beautiful service was over. The assembled people were plainly disappointed as they sadly prepared to leave the church. Slowly they made their way outward. But then suddenly the organist stopped playing as though he were stricken. The people were stunned. All eyes strained toward the altar, where a small boy was kneeling in prayer. Yes, it was little brother, Pedro's little brother. He had just put something on the altar beside all the other magnificent gifts. It was a little piece of silver. Then, miracle of miracles, the chimes sounded forth. At last, the glorious chimes were ringing. The people were so excited they could hardly believe it, for no one in the church had ever heard the chimes ring before. And then... there beside the altar stood an angel of the Lord, surrounded by the glowing rays of a golden halo. The angel raised her hand, as if to cast blessings upon little brother. Then she turned to the assembled multitude and spoke.
"Tonight, after these many long years, your wonderful Christmas chimes have sounded again. There were many beautiful gifts to the Lord, but verily I say unto you, it is not jewels or other riches of this world that please the Christ child. What pleaseth him is love and unselfish sacrifice. Tonight the chimes have rung not because of the many wonderful gifts, but simply because of the love and unselfish sacrifice of a little boy."